Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Vanguard Book Club. Today, we're going again through Chris Hedges' book, Wages of Rebellion. We're about halfway through the text right now, and I'm personally really continuing to enjoy this book. It has a lot of musings on revolt, revolution, rebellion, etc. throughout history, unsuccessful revolutions, successful ones, etc. And I'm just gleaning a lot of really interesting insights from Hedges, who, of course, has spent a lot of time around the world observing these different cultures and, throughout various points in time. So, yeah, really enjoying this book and glad to be back.
Yeah, it's always fun to do these book clubs, and I think this text works uniquely well for the way that we kind of like to do them. So some of our audience likes to follow along and read along with us, which is dope. For anybody that's jumping in for the first time, we're on chapter 5 and 6 this week, talking about first the chapter 5, the Rebel Cage, which we for the first time really in the book, Hedges dives deep into the prison industrial complex and what it means and how it functions in the American society, but it all just breeds a great, kind of field of conversation, right? A lot of the things that you might read or we might talk about, people have heard about, things that we kind of know. But I think Hedges has a very unique way of bringing the emotion and the empathy out of all of us. We kind of hear about these things in snippets and in passing on, constantly, right? News, social media, whatever the fuck, right? We're constantly inundated by horror, essentially, right? Real lived, felt pain by so many people around the world, and so it's easy to just kind of grow a certain numbness to that and just kind of turn off your sense of feeling towards it. And I think Chris Hedges does a good job of helping us analyze it, see it for what it is, and also feel the pain that we should feel living in a society that is perpetuating as much destruction as ours is.
Yeah, absolutely. And in general, I think that's one of Chris Hedges' greatest attributes as a speaker, a writer, and a thinker, just really forcing you to come to terms in no uncertain terms with the reality of the country we live in, that being America, and the empire that it is. So, yeah, absolutely. And do you want to get right into the quote, Zach?
Yeah, let's dive into the quotes because I think that the quotes from this first section that I pulled are particularly I guess damning, given what we've done as a country, right? So he basically starts off this chapter giving the rundown of all of the bullshit that the United States has done. Talking about how we have the highest documented incarceration rate. For 743 adults per 100,000. 2.3 million adults incarcerated in federal and state prisons. But he goes into the crime, and he says the omnibus crime bill pushed through the Senate with the help of Joe Biden, and really at the furor of Joe Biden. Let's not undersell his role here. Appropriated $30 billion to expand the nation's prison program, state and local law enforcement, and border patrols over a 6-year period. Gave $10.8 billion in federal matching funds to local governments to hire 100,000 new police officers over 5 years. It provided nearly $10 billion for the construction of new federal prisons. It instituted the 3 strikes proposal that mandated a life sentence for anyone convicted of 3 violent felonies. The bill permitted children as young as 13 years old to be tried as adults. It authored the use of secret evidence. The Clinton presidency under the Clinton presidency jumped from 1.5 million to 2 million. Between 1982 and 2001, total state corrections expenditure increased each year, rising from 15 billion to 53.5 billion in real dollars, according to the Department of Justice. And then we went ahead and made that guy fucking president.
Yeah, it's absolutely insane. And this is such a great passage from Hedges where he really does lay out the Democratic Party's role in the mass incarceration state that we find ourselves in here in the United States of America. Of course, he points out that we do live in the most incarcerated country in the entire world per capita. And much of that was made possible indeed by Bill Clinton and Joe Biden, who, like you said, is now the president. Obviously, the Republican Party is usually thought of as the party of law and order. And there's a stereotype pushed on the Democrats by the Republicans that, the Democrats are weak on crime. However, if you look at the Bill Clinton administration and the role, especially of Joe Biden, who co-wrote the crime bill, you'll find that, in fact, the Democratic Party has been just as vicious, if not more vicious, throughout the years, and is just as worthy of resisting in this sense. If you care about abolition, if you care about the incarceration state, if you care about criminal justice in general, this is a force in American politics that must be resisted at all costs. And that's something that a lot of people just very conveniently ignore. And I think it's just so important the way Chris Hedges outlines all of this. And it gives you some insight too into his stance, which has been, fairly unbridled over all the years of, refusing to participate in the 2-party duopoly.
Yeah, and I think that was what was so disgusting. And of course, it's constantly the tactics that's used when trying to push down a liberal candidate, right? Is the argument that's constantly employed to people in our circumstances, right, to white guys, and one that was constantly thrown at me by people who I was close to that knew I was a fence sitter on voting for Joe Biden. And it's, oh, do you care about black women? Do you care about the minority communities? How could you be so selfish? It's like, how could you be so selfish, like to just let yourself off the hook by voting for this monster and going back and feeling like all fond of yourself, right? So it's this like weird like head fake moment where they want to try and position themselves as being like the weak on crime, quote unquote, or like pro individual, pro like communities of color, whatever, when in reality they're the ones that are literally architecting these mass prison industrial systems. And it's kind of like Thomas Frank told us, right? Like Bill Clinton got past everything that Reagan couldn't get done through Congress because everybody knows that a Republican is odious. Whereas like, the wolf in sheep's clothing is always more effective. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of a hard time getting that one out. Woof. But anyway, yeah, all of this is really indicative of the kind of culture that the neoliberal party wants to create. And I think that the quote from Mumia Abu Jamal that Chris Hedges has next kind of feeds in really well to that. And the brutality of the empire was exposed under George W. Bush. The empire desperately needed a new face, a black face to seduce the public. That is the role of Barack Obama. He is the black face of empire. He was pitched to us during the most recent presidential campaign by Bill Clinton, the same Clinton who gave us NAFTA in '94 and abolished good paying manufacturing jobs for millions of workers, the same Clinton who locked us up. Clinton and Obama represent the politics of betrayal at the heart of the corporate machinery. And I think that this is exactly the case that we had, right? Cornel West calls it black faces and high places, right? You can't accept that as a condition. This kind of shallow reforms, right? It's about the structural damage that's being imposed, and these kind of surface level revisions where now a person of color can be, wreaking terror around the world. Like that's not necessarily a victory. We shouldn't, look at it as one.
Yeah, exactly. And I think he has some really great musings on the Obama presidency in general and how certain figures, people like Al Sharpton, for example, really rallied behind Obama, refused to criticize him, and cast those who did dare to criticize him, including Cornel West, as race traitors, which is totally insane to think about, as Cornel West was, of course, just critiquing American empire and the systems of capitalism being upheld by President Obama, just as he had previously Presidents Clinton, Bush, etc.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we all have to remember that Ferguson happened, Trayvon Martin happened, all of these things happened under the watchful eye of Barack Obama. It wasn't like he was there to kind of provide sweeping egalitarian reforms to the prison industrial complex. No, he could have ended the criminalization of marijuana. He could have let out all of the nonviolent drug offenders, but he spent 8 years in office and then spent the last 30 to 60 days in his lame duck period after he'd already given up a fucking Supreme Court justice. You can say that it was robbed. I think he should have fought harder. I think a lot of people think that he should have fought harder. But anyway, because stacking the court, dude, and whatever he could have fucking done. But at the same point, it's he was just pardoning people in more of a gesture, right? And I think a lot of people now will fondly remember when he pardoned a lot of people, perhaps, but it was all legacy building during his substance period. All he did was roll over and blame the Republicans for not being able to get anything done. And of course, the Republicans went to war every single fucking day trying to make sure that Barack Obama couldn't get anything done. But he kind of leaned into that and kind of used it as an excuse to kind of capitulate constantly. And obviously he was awash in corporate money. I believe he got more money than Mitt Romney did from Wall Street. So, I mean, all these kinds of things. But anyway, he says, once you disappear behind prison walls, you become prey. Rape, torture, beatings, prolonged isolation, sensory deprivation, racial profiling, chain gangs, forced labor, rancid food, children sentenced and imprisoned as adults, prisoners forced to take medications to induce lethargy, inadequate heating and ventilation, poor health, draconian sentences for nonviolent crimes, endemic violence. What's fucked up is that this is we're talking about modern American prisons. We're supposed to be like a quote unquote first world society, civilized society. Fuck all that horse shit, right? It was kind of like Hedges said in that opening quote, how he who has not seen a jail does not know what the state is, according to Leo Tolstoy. That's actually one of the things that Cornel West also likes to quote. He's like, if you want to look at a society, or understand a society, look at its prisons. It's a quote from Tolstoy. Supposedly, I've never read Tolstoy, but I imagine that's from Crime and Punishment, right? But anyway,
That's Dostoevsky, but yeah.
Oh yeah, sorry, that would have been War and Peace's Tolstoy, right? Yeah, okay, see, there we go. But anyway, but yeah, it's so fucked up. And the big thing that I wanted to talk about and why I pulled this quote is because if you think about a 13-year-old child being sent into a men's prison, everybody knows what the fuck is going to happen. That child is going to be brutalized, raped, tortured, all of the things that are happening right here. That is part of the punishment in American society. The fact that we've created, in America, and this is a lot to unpack, but the first society ever in which more men have been raped than women because of our incarcerated populations. Obviously, nobody deserves that kind of a fate, but this is orchestrated intentionally so that the rape, so that the becoming prey in prison, as Hedges said, that's part of your punishment. And, our Constitution is supposed to prevent and, outlaw cruel and unusual punishment, but it has not, and it never has. This is one of the most fucked up elements of our society. It's so barbaric, and we're allowing it to happen to children. 13-year-old boys are not men, no matter how you fucking splice it. 18-year-old boys really aren't fucking men. You know what I mean? They don't, your 18th birthday, you get moved from your fucking juvenile cell to your fucking men's prison. If you're lucky, it happens on your 18th birthday. Sometimes they do it before, right? As we just mentioned. So I don't know, just one of the most disgusting, parts of our society that I think we have gotten a little bit immune to. We think about the prison industrial complex and this like abstract term, but the real lived suffering that's happening on American soil is untold and unreckoned with for the most part.
Yeah, I totally agree. It is completely unreckoned with. And unfortunately, if you ask a lot of people, just normie individuals, about the prison system, a common response you'll get is, well, that's necessary to prevent people from wanting to commit crimes. People truly don't understand, what is going on in a lot of these prisons, in a large sense. And to be fair, that's mostly coming from my community, from people that look like me. If you go to a more poor community, Black communities, you will find often that the people in those communities actually are intimately familiar with with the conditions of prison, because they're more likely to have family members that have been affected by it. They have to go visit those family members because, again, as Chris Hedges points out, the sentencing is so disproportionate. I believe he pointed out that in Alabama, they have a 30% Black population, but half of their death row is Black people. So this is clearly an assault on the poor and marginalized communities of this country. It's absolutely neo-slavery. There's no doubt that it's one of the worst crimes against humanity that's going on. And like you said, what is supposedly a first world country, the greatest country on earth, the land of the free. Total fucking jokes. And when you really do start to look into and think about the prisons and conditions, absolutely it violates our right to have punishment free of cruel and unusual conditions. Even disregarding the horrors of such practices as solitary confinement, I would argue that the conditions in most prisons absolutely qualify as cruel and unusual, depriving people of sunlight, vitamin D, depriving people of nutritious food, forcing them to eat slop.
So important to say that outside of the individuals that were wrongly convicted or were at the hands of political imprisonment from the U.S. government and had all of their rights stripped from them, there's also just a systemic fact where these people, where recidivism is something that is actually beneficial to the system, right? They want people to be reincarcerated. They do not want them to escape, and that's why this perpetual trauma incursion, this total fucking stripping of the self and destruction of the human spirit that occurs when you're incarcerated is designed to keep you within this confines of the system forever. And that's generational, right? Because that generational trauma, but also the circumstances of being economically desperate and having limited opportunity, and then being forced to do things like sell drugs or protect yourself because the police aren't protecting you and your community, so now you have to fill in that role. All kinds of stuff that like it makes people end up in prison for things that you might broadly be like, oh well, that person shot somebody and they deserve to be in fucking prison, they deserve this squalor. Like, of course nobody fucking deserves this shit, and even the most hardened fucking criminals should be met with treatment, right? Even the most odious people that do truly have mental problems that will drive them to do horrible acts. Like I thought we lived in a society where we wanted to treat those people and provide them with the kindness that they need. That's kind of the way that I think we all need to approach it. And I think that generally, if you get people to talk about it, they do promote treatment over just blatant brutality, and it's just a matter of explaining to people the horrors of what's happening and so on. But to move on to the next quote, Bonnie Kernith said that the for-profit prison companies have created an entrepreneurial class like that of the Southern slaveholders, one dependent on the poor and on bodies of color as a source for income. And she described federal and state departments of corrections as a state of mind. This state of mind, she said in the interview, led to Abu Ghraib, Bagram, and Guantanamo, and what is going on in U.S. prisons right at this moment. And I just think that's incredibly prescient, right? That it created the entrepreneurial class like that of the Southern slaveholders, one dependent on the poor and bodies of color as a source for income. That is why they don't give a shit about recidivism in the United States. They want to talk about law and order, but they also want to make sure that people reoffend and stay in the system so that they keep making essentially the new plantation owners. That's what wardens are. They're the new plantation owners.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one of the best things about this chapter and about Chris Hedges in general, actually, is creating the connection in people's mind, myself included. I, didn't think about all this at one point until I read some of this. But really creating that link between racism and capitalism and how they're so codependent on how they absolutely fuel one another. And I think that obviously slavery, is the original example of that. Slavery wasn't just something that was born out of racism. It was, of course, born out of the capitalism. People were brought here to make money for white people. Similarly, the incarceration system, it's not just because of racism. It's not like, everyone's just deciding to lock up their fellow neighbors of color just because of racism. No, it's because of the industry, industry of mass incarceration, which is so profitable. Also, he talks about how, the Ku Klux Klan and a lot of the lynchings that occurred, those weren't even just the result of racism. A lot of times black people were accused of raping white women and such, but that was more of just a guise. In reality, a lot of what was going on was, post the end of slavery, white businesses becoming terrified of the competition posed by black business owners. And when they saw their profits being chipped away, that's when they decided to take these heinous actions, get together these gangs of fellow white people to carry out these, horrific events, which were, of course, a product of racism. But, racism plus capitalism creates this whole other beast, I think. And that's something that I just believe Chris Hedges has really articulated well.
Yeah, that beast we call America, right? Racism and capitalism to the extreme. But yeah, so we're doing a bit of a two-part pod on chapters. That was the last quote I had pulled for chapter 5. We'll be getting into the next chapter 6, which tackles the topic of vigilante justice. And I guess a good place to start would be where Hedges does, and he says any rebellion must contend with this American violence, especially vigilante violence, as well as the sickness of the gun culture that is its natural expression. As it has done throughout American history, the state under siege will turn to extrajudicial groups of armed thugs to repress populist movements. Radical change in America is paid for with blood. That's cryptic as fuck, but very spot on in true Hedges fashion. Doesn't mince words, but I think it is true, and I think that the gun culture is more of America is more endemic of that culture of violence, and I think that culture of violence comes from the culture of capitalism, this ruthless competition that I have to get mine if you can't get yours. And also, to take this in, one of the things that Thomas Piketty points out in his, book Capital and Ideology is that human beings are rational creatures. So we have to find a way to explain away the inequalities that we see around us. One of the most effective ways that we explain away inequality in America is the myth of meritocracy and also racism. And typically, when you're looking at, in the past, it was much more racism than the myth of meritocracy, though they've always worked in tandem.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought this was a really interesting passage of the book from Hedges, and I really also appreciated how he drew attention to this notion of the vigilante and how it's been extra romanticized by Hollywood films and pop culture in general in this country. Although what it really does is promote this culture of violence, this culture of extrajudicial murder, vengeance, all of these ugly human traits that we really should try to, be separating ourselves from as a humane society, not encouraging or romanticizing. And again, this is played out in so many horrible, oppressive, racist ways throughout history. It's been, used to undermine the working class uprising, unions, movements, etc. And Hedges just does such a great job in laying it all out.
Yeah, and it kind of goes into what you were saying earlier, right, with the Ku Klux Klan and all this stuff, and much of this passage, Hedges goes into two very decidedly different individuals, Thomas, or chapter rather, not passage, Thomas Paine and also Nathan Bedford Forrest, who, if for no other reason do you know the man, he's the reason that Forrest Gump gets named Forrest Gump in that fucking movie. But yeah, he was a radical lunatic. Confederate general. If you have ever read about Fort Pillow, it was a tragic slaughtering in the Civil War where black women and children were mercilessly slaughtered at the behest of this Nathan Bedford Forrest guy, who has monuments all over the fucking South. By the way, Hedges also talks about how fucked up that is. But yeah, you mentioned one thing about how Hollywood has tended to glamorize these vigilante groups throughout its history, and I think that one thing that's also interesting to grapple with it, obviously there's the legacy of the what's the fucking movie? I know you're gonna know it. Yeah, Birth of a Nation, exactly. Violence in America is not restricted to state violence. There is a tradition of vigilante violence that is used, usually with the state's tacit, if unofficial, blessing to crush dissent, to give repressed minorities in a state of fear, or to exact revenge on those the state has branded as traitors. It is a product of hatred, not hope. It is directed against the weak, not the strong, and it is deeply ingrained in the American psyche. America has been formed and shaped by slave patrols, gunslingers, Pinkerton and Baldwin Felts detective, gangs of strikebreakers, hired gun thugs, company militias, and the American Legion, originally right-wing World War I veterans who attacked Union agitators, especially those belonging to the industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies. The influence on the country of the White Citizens Council, the White League, which carried out public militia drills and functioned as the armed wing of the Democratic Party of the South, the Knights of the White Camellia, and the Ku Klux Klan. So this is the long-trotting list of American history. These are the people who, form the right-wing militias. And if we go to the next quote, we can talk about how it kind of presents itself more recently, more modernly. He says vigilante groups in America do not trade violence for violence. They're mostly white men who often prey on people of color as radicals. They are capitalism's ideological vanguard. Its shock troop used to break populist movements and tyrannize the oppressed, and they will be unleashed against any mass movement that seriously threatens the structures of capitalist power and calls for rebellion. Imagine if, instead of right-wing militias, so-called eco-terrorists who have never been found responsible for taking a single American life had showed up armed in Nevada, April 12, 2014, to challenge the federal government's attempt to thwart rancher Cliven Bundy from continuing to graze his cattle on public land. How would the authorities have responded if those carrying guns had been from the environmental group Earth First? What if they had been black? I think we all know how it would have been different.
Yeah, and this quote really reminds me of what recently went down on January 6th, obviously at the Capitol Hill insurrection. A lot of people made the point that had those protesters been Black Lives Matter protesters, the response would have been massively different. But regardless, even of black or white, I think if those protesters had been radical leftist, anti-capitalist protesters in general, regardless of colors, I mean, it might have even scared them more if there had been a broad racial, coalition. I think that would have been met with extreme force. I think they would have been terminated immediately. I don't even think it would have been a question. And of course, he makes that same point with the Bundy Ranch. Had these been Islamic ranchers, or had these been black ranchers, or had this been a leftist cause in general, an environmentalist cause, it would have been an extremely different response.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just compare it to George Floyd, right? But there are a number of examples of this. Wasn't there something, and we can cut this out if there's absolutely no basis for this, but I'm pretty sure there was at least another armed militia somewhere in the Pacific Northwest after 2014 where something like this happened. I can't remember exactly what it is, but either way, we've seen this throughout history, right? Right wingers, hoot and holler guys, they'll be able to do like some sort of like small standoff with the government. However, you can't even do a peaceful protest, to protest the police if you're, left wingers without literal chemical weapons being deployed on you. You're not met with any kind of peaceful, we understand it's your right to carry your firearms on federal property to protect yourself in this great nation. No, it's like, get the fuck on the ground. Like, like, we will fucking shoot you. Like, this is how the police talk to left wingers, black people, fucking whatever, right? Instead, they're greeted with, hey, you know what, boys? I'm gonna meet you all around back once I clock off at 5. You know what I'm saying?
Did you want to go to the next quote?
Any revolutionary movement that builds a mass following will have to contend with the state-orchestrated vilification and vigilante violence that plagued Paine's life. So he's talking about Thomas Paine, who, if anybody hasn't followed the life story of Thomas Paine, that dude was the real radical of the United States Revolution. That dude is the real deal. Common Sense is actually a radical manifesto, unlike many we've seen. And I think Chris Hedges does a great job of kind of illustrating that. I mean, after the United States Revolution, like, Thomas Paine wasn't convinced. Like, he was like, no, guys, like, the fucking capitalists won this shit. The aristocracy won this shit. Like, don't tell me to be happy with my nation until, the elderly are taken care of. Like, the poor are fed, all this kind of stuff. So anyway, real based character. But anyway, to continue, vitriol and violence will be unleashed with the tacit approval of the state on all who resist, even non-violently. These reactionary movements, while defining themselves as the guardians of patriotism and the Christian faith, will draw on the deep reserves of racial hostility, the hidden agenda of right-wing militias, the Tea Party, the lunatic fringe of the Republican Party, and the National Rifle Association, and the survivalist cults is to ensure that guns will keep the home and family from being overrun by crazed black hordes that will escape their colonies in our urban slums.
Yeah, I thought overall that this was another great chapter of the book in general. And I really enjoyed learning a little bit more about Thomas Paine too, who, as you said, really was one of the actual revolutionary characters from that period of time, which of course was mostly characterized by lots of rich aristocratic white slave owning males that were kind of, pretending to be revolutionaries. Really, they didn't want to pay their taxes. But yeah, I think that this was a really interesting part of the book. And, just interestingly talking about how the vitriol and violence with the tacit approval of the state, it often is approved of by the state because it's usually, citizen on citizen violence. It's rarely actually directed in a kind of revolutionary, energy or momentum towards systems of oppression, capitalism, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, I think that I always gave Thomas Paine a little bit less consideration because he's one of those figures that we actually do get mentioned in the up and coming in standard K through 12 public school learning. However, they just don't tell you any of his real message. They're like, he published Common Sense and it was really important. Don't talk about anything that Common Sense actually says because we didn't get it. We didn't fucking get it. And one of the things that actually, this is really irrelevant, but it made me go back to Thomas Paine is because when you listen to the list of people that Zach De La Roca talks about in Renegades of Funk, one of them's Thomas Paine being like a true revolutionary. And I was like, that's the guy that's read his book. So I checked out Common Sense. I was like, holy shit, this is real radical stuff. But anyway, we can move on to the last quote because I'm getting a little rambly, but essentially it says any revolutionary movement, or sorry, the breakdown of we cut this out. Clap. The breakdown of American society will trigger a popular backlash, which we glimpsed in the Occupy movement, and I would say we've glimpsed again a few more times since then. But it will also energize the traditional armed vigilante groups that embrace a version of American fascism that fusions Christian and national symbols. The longer we remain in a state of political paralysis, dominated by a corporate elite that refuses to respond to the growing misery and governed by an ineffectual liberal elite, the more the rage of the white male underclass, whose economic status often reflects poor blacks, will find expression through violence. If it remains true to the American tradition, this violence will not be directed at the power elite, but with the single out minorities, dissidents, activists, radicals, and scapegoats. The language of all violence always presages violence. And I think that that's pretty true. As far as timelines go, I think that I don't know, if the radical fascist right it has the power to rise up right now. I would wonder almost if this is a slow time for them, because I feel like if we're being honest, the big power holder right now is the elite liberal cabal, right? The people who want to push the omnibus crime bill. but also pretend that they're going to, take a knee during George Floyd, right? But what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that that the Christian fascist is the ultimate threat at this time? I think it certainly may have seemed that way, but overall, right now, it seems like they've kind of been kicked in the nuts, and the liberals have taken all the cards and chips.
I think it's definitely interesting, and this book was written and published in 2015. So I'm not 100% sure how much Donald Trump was on Chris Hedges' mind, but he does talk about how in this breakdown of society, we often see people uniting around a demagogue or a strong man, someone that's kind of speaking the language of this, faux populist fascism, disempowering the minorities, blaming people's issues on the minorities, a complete personification of toxic masculinity and, capitalism, excess, etc. He talks about how this figure will rise in a society like this, and how a figure like that can, in a movement like that, can, then further trigger the downfall of the society, of the empire. So I'm really interested to know how much he was referencing or thinking about Donald Trump in that moment. But I think it's fair to say, even in Trump's absence, that silent beast remains, and it could be awoken again at any moment. Not that the Biden administration and the Democrats being in power has ameliorated the issues at all. But I guess that the head, that ugly, faux populist fascism has kind of been put to bed, at least a little bit momentarily. But it could rear its head just as easily, exploiting all of these issues that the neoliberalism, currently represented by the Democratic Party, is not living up to. If people aren't desperate, then these urges are a lot less likely to come to the forefront. Just like how Chris Hedges talks about, committing crimes is often something that happens as a result of impoverished conditions. Most people don't just want to commit crimes. Most people aren't born ready to go out and commit crimes. It's a direct result of conditions surrounding you for the vast majority of cases, poverty. And the same can be said for this kind of like white nationalist fascist uprising, this deeply, like I said, toxic masculinity inspired feelings. These are festering in times of economic desperation, and this palpable sense of decline too in our home country and abroad. So I think this is all, creating these conditions where at any point, um, this kind of demagoguery can occur and capture this movement and direct its energy in the worst possible way.
Yeah, I think that's certainly fair, and I think that Chris Hedges was remarkably prescient in kind of predicting what would bring Trump. And I think a lot of the fascist undertones that he was talking about, the Christian right, all these kinds of things, they were largely responsible for getting Trump across the finish line and making sure that he, wasn't, basically taken out like Bernie Sanders was when he was trying to rise through the Democratic Party. So I think that's very true, and just the fucking immense popularity that a figure like him has. It's true. I just think that, I just wanted to articulate, I think, a little bit about the fact that, despite the fact that that's, may have been, temporarily or for the time being tampered out by Joe Biden, I think that, obviously his actions are just as odious. And I think that they're freshening the face of it, creates its own host of problems. Of course, I would love to know what Hedges thinks about that, as it presents to these topics.
Yeah, well, I would agree with that. But when it does come to fueling the rage of the white male underclass, as Chris Hedges puts it, I do think that there is a noticeable difference in tone from Biden and Trump, who, again, the policies may be the same, but when it comes to your, average white working class, economically desperate person, they may not be realizing the depth of that. It's more in the rhetoric and behavior of someone like Trump that really spoke to those people and galvanized them behind these very ugly set of racist, xenophobic positions. So I think I maybe think that's what he's referencing specifically as far as the demagoguery there. But as far as policy, yeah, it's the same shit with a nicer face on it. That's for sure.
No, I think that's exactly probably the case that would be differential. But I wonder how does that stain the movement now that Trump has lost, right? Because I think that if he runs again, he'll definitely get the nomination. But then it comes down to you put up Biden versus Trump again. A lot of people think that Trump could maybe win. I think it's tough to win an election after you've lost like that. So I don't know. I think that would actually hurt Trump, and he wouldn't have any incumbency bias, and Biden would have incumbency bias. So I think that that's all important to bear out. But I just wonder where that leaves this, like, burgeoning like underground like movement, when you hear a lot about how, oh, we're actually moving in towards like there's all kinds of different people that are trying to push the Republican Party in one direction or another. I just wonder what will win out, and if they'll move past the Christian iconography and embrace something else that's equally as fascist and totalitarian, but not as rooted in that kind of like old school symbology.
Yeah, well, ultimately, I think that comes down to just the competence and effectiveness of the messenger in question. So, if it comes to Donald Trump, were he to run again in 2024, I think were he to go back to embracing some of that more economically populist rhetoric, some of that more like Steve Bannon-esque stuff that he was, regurgitating in the early days of his run, really focusing on that America First shit, and less of the culture war stuff, less of the Fox News talking points. I think he might be able to once again effectively, weaponize that against Joe Biden, who again at this point is looking pretty feeble in his presidency. He hasn't really, provided anything tangible for the American people in a while, and unless he does do that again before 2024, I think he'll totally be making himself vulnerable to another faux populist movement, be it led by Donald Trump or somebody else, whoever his heir apparent may be. So, I think what it says about the movement is just that, or not about the movement, but rather the establishment, is just how vulnerable it is at any given moment. But especially when the leaders, the managers of the status quo, as currently represented by Joe Biden, the Democrats, completely fail to adequately address the needs of the people. So, it comes down to a crapshoot. It just comes down to who's the better campaigner then, versus a president, an actual economically left president who would have guaranteed the rights of its people, food, water, housing, etc. I don't think that vulnerability would exist.
Yeah, and I mean, Joe Biden's opening himself up for an attack just like that, because he's about to let the eviction moratorium expire. They're not, giving any extensions on the federal unemployment. Obviously, they're not giving any extensions on the people who have to pay back their student loans, which obviously I'm not looking forward to. But that's pittance, and compared to the fucking stressors that people who are facing that, fucking being homeless, it's completely disgusting, and it's also just bad politics, right? Because this is going to be able to just create more, I mean, it's just going to create worse economic conditions, and that's just going to spiral people back towards, I don't know, kind of fascist person. The only thing that I was really challenging is that I think that it might be smart for the Republican Party to move away from this kind of Christian iconography, but that just could be me living in my own bubble. I feel like even in Kansas City, though, like I've just started to like experience less, like come across less deeply religious people. When I was a kid living in the suburbs of Johnson County, I feel like that was something that I could not fucking escape. Just
Well,
constantly being inundated with the fucking over the top religious people who would constantly like fucking like bring up random shit about God. I remember it was like the fucking controversy of the fucking school when I told everybody that I didn't fucking believe in God for the first time, and but it's just like
well,
so
I think what you said there is actually why they're not going to abandon it. Because if you go back to the suburbs, it's inescapable. And where are the biggest voting
I think it's
blocks?
still like that in the suburbs though.
Oh, absolutely. 100%. It's like that in the suburbs. And to be honest, the Republican Party, they need the evangelical vote is to the Republican Party as the African American vote is to the Democratic Party. They can't win an election without it. So as much as, someone like Trump would love to probably drop the whole Christian act, it's really just not feasible. They need that shit. If Trump hadn't picked Mike Pence, I don't think he would have won, because I think the evangelical community would have been a little bit too turned off by him and his antics throughout the years, a la Stormy Daniels, etc.
That's why he didn't win Kansas in the primary.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's definitely necessary, and unfortunately, I guess for them, like I said, I don't think Donald Trump is a real Christian. I don't think he probably really enjoys playing a Christian either. But yeah, I do think that's a necessary. I do think that's going to remain a necessary part of this, emerging fascist coalition.
Yeah. Anyway, I thought that was a good chat today, guys. Really into getting into the Chris Hedges book club, kind of more free form, less structured. We do these pre-recorded so that Gavin and I can just fucking talk shit to each other and kind of have it a little more stress-free when we're trying to think about books and stuff. But it's really good time chatting with everybody. We hope you like it. It always goes out to the patrons first. A little bit of a thank you for helping us keep trucking along, keep doing this kind of content. We obviously deeply appreciate it. If you want to get the content early, you can find it at patreon.com/the Vanguard channel. Shout out to everybody that watches this. We love you.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys, and hope you're really enjoying this book along with us. If you're not reading along, I would really urge you to. It's a not just interesting and important book, but it's honestly compelling to read or listen to if you prefer to listen to it like I do via audiobooks. It's a great experience. It's not boring. It's not dry. It's that exact Chris Hedges clarity that you expect and want. And it really does go a long way, in my opinion, at least, in providing insights and musings into this particular subject, which is, of course, so relevant to all of us on the left. So, yeah, thanks again, guys, for tuning in, and we'll catch you guys next week.